On a moon where the rain never stopped and the sky wept great tears day and night, Cale Voss stood alone outside the grand gates of Lord Zirin's palace, his boots sinking slightly into the slick black stone beneath him. The air smelled of ozone, and something sour like old metal left too long in the damp. His coat was patched in 3 places and his blaster hung low on his hip. Not for show, but because he had used it twice that week, already once against pirates and once against a debt collector who thought Cale owed him credits he did not owe. The palace before him rose like a twisted spine of glass and bone, its towers curling toward the clouds as if trying to claw their way out of the world below. Banners of deep violet fluttered, from every spire, each one stitched with the sigil of House Zirin, a coiled serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of endless hunger and endless cruelty. Cale had heard stories about Zirin, long before he ever set foot on this forsaken rock. Stories about how the Xeno-Lord collected beings like others collected rare coins, how he played games with lives and laughed when they broke. But Cale was not here for stories. He was here because he lost a bet. It had been a stupid thing, really. A game of chance aboard a smuggler's freighter during a long jump between systems. Zirin had been there too. Cloaked in silks that shimmered like oil on water, his eyes too large for his face, and his smile too wide, he had challenged Cale to a round of void dice just for fun, just for sport, and Cale, who rarely said no to a challenge, had agreed. He lost, and now he stood in the rain waiting for his prize. A servant finally appeared. Not human, but something slender and pale with too many joints in its arms. It bowed without speaking and gestured for Cale to follow him through the gates. The path inside was lined with statues of creatures Cale did not recognize, some with wings, some with multiple heads, all frozen in poses of agony or ecstasy. It was hard to tell which was worse. They entered a hall so vast Cale could not see the ceiling, only a soft glow far above like distant stars trapped in glass. Zirin sat on a raised dais, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his robes pooling around him like spilled ink. He did not rise when Cale approached. He did not even look up right away. Cale," he said at last, his voice smooth like poisoned honey. "You came. I was beginning to think you had forgotten our little agreement." "I do not forget," Debts, Cale said flatly. Good Zirin chuckled and finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were black with no whites, no pupils, just endless dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them now. "As promised, I owe you a gift." He snapped his fingers from the shadows at the back of the hall. A hovering chair emerged, gliding silently across the polished floor. It carried a young woman wrapped in a thin silver shawl. Her hair, the color of moonlight, fell over her shoulders in soft waves. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were the palest silver Cale had ever seen. They held no anger, no fear, just a quiet emptiness that made his chest tighten. "This is Lyra," Zirin said with a wave of his hand. "My youngest daughter, or what remains of her." Cale frowned. She looked unharmed, but there was something wrong with the way she sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her legs unmoving beneath the shawls. "He cannot walk," Zirin explained as if reading his thoughts. "A birth defect, or so the healers claimed. They tried everything. Neural grafts, biowires, even old earth prayers, nothing worked. She is broken. Cale, utterly useless except as a decoration. And since you lost our game so spectacularly, I thought you might enjoy a broken thing of your own." The courtiers around the hall tittered softly behind jeweled hands, their amusement sharp and cold. Cale said nothing for a long moment. He studied Lyra, not as a prize, not as a joke, but as a person. And in that silence, something passed. Between them, a flicker in her eyes so brief most would have missed it. But Cale had spent years reading the smallest signs in battle, the twitch of a finger, the shift of weight before a strike. He saw it. She was not broken. She was waiting. "Very well," Cale said finally. "I accept the gift." Zirin's smile widened. "Showing too many teeth, you are a strange one." Cale most would have demanded credits or a weapon or a ship, but you take a silent cripple without protest. Are you lonely? Or just foolish? Perhaps. Both, Cale said, and stepped forward to take the controls of the hovering chair. It responded to his touch with a soft hum and turned smoothly toward the exit as he guided Lyra out of the hall. The rain had not let up. It fell harder now, drumming against the glass canopy above the walkway. Cale did not speak. He simply walked beside her chair, his presence steady and quiet. Lyra did not look at him, but her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her shawl. They reached his ship, parked on the far edge of the landing pad, a battered freighter with scorch marks along the hull, and a name long since faded from the side. It was not much, but it was home. Cale opened the ramp and the chair floated up on its own, as if it knew the way inside. He followed and sealed the hatch behind them. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence, a comforting sound after the oppressive grandeur of the palace. He led her to the small guest cabin, the cleanest room he had. It held a cot, a small desk, and a viewport that looked out onto the endless gray clouds of the moon beyond. "You can stay here," he said simply. Lyra finally turned her head to look at him fully, her silver eyes searching his face for mockery, for lust, for greed. She found none, only tired honesty. "Why did you take me?" she asked, her voice soft but clear like wind through dry grass. "Because no one deserves to be given away as a joke," he said. She blinked once, then looked away toward the viewport outside. The rain streaked the glass, like tears. They were silent for a while. Then from the corridor behind them came a soft scrabbling sound like claws on metal. Cale turned just as a small shape rounded the corner. It was Ember, his dragon, no bigger than a large dog with scales the color of rust and old blood. Its eyes glowed a soft gold and smoke curled from its nostrils, not from anger but from contentment. Ember had been with Cale since it was an egg found in the wreckage of a derelict ship drifting near a dead star. No one knew what kind of creature it was, but it had imprinted on Cale and followed him ever since. Ember padded forward slowly, its head low, its wings folded tight against its back. It stopped a few feet from Lyra and tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Then it did something Cale had never seen it do before. It lowered itself onto its belly and let out a low, gentle hum. The sound vibrated through the floor and seemed to wrap around the room like a warm blanket. Lyra's breath caught. She reached out one hand slowly. Ember did not flinch. It leaned forward and pressed its snout gently into her palm. Cale watched in silence as something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, a bond forming in the space between breaths. He did not understand it, but he did not need to. He turned and left them alone in the cockpit. He sat in the pilot's chair and stared out at the storm. The ship's systems hummed softly around him, ready to jump the moment he gave the command. He thought about Zirin's mocking laughter, about the courtiers' cruel smiles, about the way Lyra had sat so still, so quiet, as if she had spent her whole life holding her breath. And he thought about Ember's strange reaction. There was more to her than broken bones and empty eyes, much more. But for now she was safe. And that was enough. Outside, the rain began to ease just a little, the clouds thinning at the edges as if sensing the ship's intent to leave. Cale powered up the engines. They would be gone before dawn, and no one would miss a broken gift or so, Zirin thought. Days passed in the quiet hum of the freighter's corridors. Lyra stayed mostly in her cabin. She did not ask for much food, water, a blanket. When the ship's heat failed in Sector 4, she said nothing, just pulled the silver shawl tighter around her shoulders. Cale checked on her once a cycle, not too often. Not too little, just enough to make sure she was still breathing. Ember spent most of its time with her curled at the foot of her cot or resting its chin on the edge of her hovering chair, its golden eyes never leaving her face. Cale did not press her to speak. He had learned long ago that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was armor. The ship drifted through the outer rim, a lawless stretch of space where nav beacons flickered. Like dying stars, and patrols were rare unless you owed someone credits, which Cale did not anymore. He had paid his last debt with blood and silence, and now he flew free. But freedom did not mean safety. On the 7th night after leaving Zirin's moon, the proximity alarm blared sharp and sudden. Cale jolted awake from a half-sleep in the cockpit chair, his hand already on his blaster, before his eyes fully opened on the screen. 3 jagged signatures closed in fast scavers, their hulls patched. With scrap and spite they flew like wolves hunting wounded. Cale cursed under his breath and flipped the comms open. Ember, get Lyra to the safe room now. The dragon let out a low growl and vanished down the corridor in a blur of rust-colored scales. Kale armed the ship's turrets manually. They were old and slow to respond, but they would have to do. He did not want to fight, but scavers did not ask. They took, or they burned. The first shot rocked the freighter, a glancing blow against the rear shield. It flared red, then died the second hit. The engine housing sparks flew across the cockpit panel and the lights flickered in the safe room. A small reinforced chamber near the core Ember stood in front of Lyra, its wings half spread, its body tense, smoke curling steadily from its nostrils. Lyra's chair hovered just behind it, her hands gripping the armrests, her silver eyes wide but not with fear, with something else, something sharp and focused. The door hissed open as Kale stumbled in, a fresh cut bleeding above his eyebrow. His blaster smoking in his hand, 2 of the scaver ships were gone, blown apart by a lucky shot. But the third had boarded through the cargo bay. "They are coming," he said quickly. 5, maybe 6, armed with plasma cutters, and old Earth shotgun. Sember snarled low in its throat, its scales beginning to glow faintly along its spine. Ra looked at Kyle, then at the door, then back at him. "You cannot hold them all," he said. Reading her thought, "I do not need to move to fight," she said so softly he almost missed it before he could ask what she meant. The door exploded inward, metal shrieking as it tore from its hinges. 3 scavers charged in their armor, dented their faces hidden behind cracked visors. They raised their weapons. Kale fired first, dropping the lead scaver with a shot to the chest. Ember lunged at the second, its jaws closing around the scaver's arm with a sickening crunch. The third scaver aimed at Lyra, and that was when the floor moved, not shook, not trembled, but bent like soft clay rising in a wave beneath the scaver's feet. The metal curled up around his legs, trapping him mid-step. His weapon clattered to the ground as he struggled, but the floor held firm like a living hand. Kyle froze. Blaster half-raisedly, Ra sat perfectly still, her palms flat against the armrests of her chair. Her eyes closed, her breath slow and even. The trapped scaver screamed something about witch blood, about cursed ones, and began clawing at the metal now, hard as stone around his legs. Ember turned its head to look at Lyra, then back at Kale, its golden eyes wide with something like awe. The remaining scavers in the corridor must have heard the scream because they retreated fast, their boots echoing. Down the hall toward the cargo bay. Kyle did not chase them. He sealed the safe room door and turned to Lyra. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. She opened her eyes slowly, the silver depths now bright with something like exhaustion and relief. "My father told everyone I was paralyzed," she said. "But that was not true, not really. My body works, it always has. But if I move too much, if I lose focus, the power slips, it becomes wild, dangerous. So they bound me not with chains, but with stillness. They called it protection. But it was a cage." Kale stared at the metal floor still shaped around the scaver's legs. It had not returned to normal. It stayed bent as if frozen in time. "You can shape matter," she said, not as a question. "Only when I am still," she replied. "Only when my mind is quiet. Movement scatters it like wind through smoke." "So your paralysis was a seal?" She finished, not from injury, but from fear. "My father feared what I could do. So he made me a statue. A pretty broken thing to display and forget." Kale looked at the trapped scaver who had stopped struggling and now sat slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. "You could have told me sooner. I did not know if you would believe me or if you would fear me too." Ember padded over and nudged her hand gently, its warmth seeming to steady her. Kale exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Right," he said. "Then we train over the next few cycles." They carved out a routine. Kale cleared the cargo bay of crates and old machinery, creating a wide, open space with reinforced walls. Lyra sat in the center on a simple mat, her chair parked nearby. Ember lay just outside the circle, its presence a quiet anchor. First, she could only affect small things, a bolt on the floor, a loose panel in the wall. She would close her eyes, breathe, and the metal would shift slightly, curling or flattening under her will. But it took everything she had and left her trembling. Kyle watched silently, never interrupting, never pushing. On the 4th day, she managed to lift a whole section of the floor 3 feet square and hold it steady for nearly 10 seconds before it crashed back down with a thunderous clang. She gasped and doubled over, sweat beading on her forehead. Too much, she whispered. Ember moved closer and rested its head on her knee, its warmth radiating through the fabric of her shawl. Kale knelt beside her. You do not have to do this. Yes, she said, I do. If they find out what I am, they will come for me again. Not as scavers, but as hunters. And next time they will bring chains that even I cannot bend. He nodded. Then we keep going. They trained harder after that. Lyra learned to focus not just on stillness, but on intent. She did not need to move her body, but she could move her mind like a blade. Sharp and precise, she shaped metal into shields, into barriers, into simple tools. She even managed to repair a cracked conduit in the engine room, just by touching it. With her mind, Kale began to see her not as fragile, not as broken, but as something rare, something ancient. One night as they drifted through a quiet nebula, its colors painting the cockpit in soft blues and purples, Lyra spoke without looking at him. People are called the veiled kin. She said they lived in the deep void long before. Your kind walked upright. They could shape stars if they sat long enough, if they held their breath for centuries. Are they gone? Most, yes. Scattered, hunted, forgotten. My father was half-blood. He married into House Zirin for power. But when I was born, with the full gift, he panicked. He thought if he hid it, if he made me seem weak, no one would come looking. But someone always comes. Kale said yes, she said always. Ember let out a soft rumble from its perch on the co-pilot seat, its eyes reflecting the nebula's glow. Kale leaned back in his chair. Then we make sure they do not take you. Lyra looked at him. Then, for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. Thank you. They did not speak again that night, but something had shifted between them. Not just trust, but purpose. The ship sailed on through the dark, carrying a silent elf woman, a battle-worn human, and a dragon that burned with starlight. And somewhere far behind them, in the heart of a glass palace, a xenolord laughed at his own clever joke, unaware that the broken gift he had tossed away was already becoming a storm. The freighter drifted through a quiet stretch of space where the stars burned cold and distant. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor of the cargo bay, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes closed. Ember lay a few feet away, its scales pulsing faintly with a soft inner light like embers breathing in the dark. Kale stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching but not interfering. He had learned not to speak during her focus, not to move too suddenly, not to break the fragile thread of her concentration. She had grown stronger in the past cycles, no longer trembling. After every attempt, no longer needing hours to recover. She could now hold a section of wall bent into a shield for nearly a full minute, and once she had reshaped an entire bulkhead to seal a radiation leak without rising from her mat. But she was still holding back. Kale saw it in the way her jaw tightened when she pushed too far, in the way her fingers twitched as if fighting the urge to move her body to chase the power instead of letting it come to her. One evening after training, he sat beside her on the mat. Not too close, just near enough to talk. You are not telling me everything, he said. Lyra opened her eyes slowly, the silver depths calm, but guarded. What do you mean, the power you have? It is not just metal, is it? She looked away toward the far wall where a patch of hull still bore the dent from the scaver attack. No, she said softly. It is not just metal. It is all matter, stone, water, air, even light. If I am still enough, if my mind is clear enough, then why not try? Because it is dangerous. She turned back to him, her voice low. If I lose control even for a second, it could unravel something inside me. Or worse, it could wake something else. My people believed the power came from the void itself, from the space between stars. It listens, it waits. And if you call too loudly, it answers in ways you cannot undo. Kyle studied her face. He had seen many things in his years, things that defied reason, things that bled logic dry. But he had never seen fear like this in her. Not of others, but of herself. All right, he said. Then we go slow. They began with water. Kyle filled a metal basin and set it before her. The liquid still and dark in the dim light. Lyra placed her hands on the rim of the basin and closed her eyes at first. Nothing happened. Then the surface of the water rippled. Not from movement, but from within. The ripples formed shapes, spirals, then symbols. Then a face faint and fleeting before dissolving back into calm Ember lifted its head and watched the water with wide eyes. Lyra gasped and pulled her hands back. It saw me, she whispered. What did... The void Cale did not understand. But he did not ask, he simply refilled the basin and sat beside her again. This time he placed a hand on Ember's back. Feeling the dragon's warmth pulse in time with Lyra's breathing, they tried again. This time the water rose in a slow spiral hovering above the basin, forming a perfect sphere that caught the light and bent it into colors Cale had never seen before. Lyra held it for nearly 30 seconds before letting it fall back with a soft splash. She was panting but smiling. I did not break. She said, no, you did not. Over. The next few days they worked with air, shaping it into barriers so thin they were invisible, but strong enough to stop a bullet. They worked with light, bending it around Lyra so she vanished from sight, not by cloaking but by redirecting every photon. That touched her. Ember seemed to understand more than Cale. It would often sit with its eyes closed during her sessions, its body humming as if resonating with her power. One night, as the ship passed through the shadow of a dead planet, Lyra asked, Cale questioned, you ever wonder why you found me? He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. I do not believe in fate, but you took me when no one else would. Maybe I was tired of jokes. Maybe I saw someone who deserved better. She looked down at her hands. Father used to say the veiled kin were not meant to walk among others. We were meant to sit at the edge of creation and shape it from afar. But I never wanted to sit forever. I wanted to see the things I shaped, to feel them. You can still feel them, not. The same way. Cale was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the storage locker. He returned with a small object in his hand and placed it in her palm. It was a smooth river stone, dark and cool, worn by time and water. Hold it, he said. She closed her fingers around it. Now tell me what it feels like. Cold, heavy, old. Now shape it. She hesitated, then closed her eyes. The stone in her hand began to glow faintly. Then it softened like warm wax, reshaping itself into a tiny dragon, no bigger than her thumb. Its wings folded, its eyes closed. She opened her eyes and stared at it in wonder. I made it alive, she whispered. Not alive, but real. Ember leaned forward and sniffed the stone dragon, then let out a soft purr. Lyra looked at Cale, tears glistening in her silver eyes. Thank you. For what? For seeing me not as a statue but as a person. He nodded and sat back down. You are not broken, Lyra. You never were. They sat in silence as the ship sailed on through the endless dark. But peace never lasted long in the Outer Ryman, the 10th night after the stone dragon. The long-range sensors pinged a faint signal repeating every 30 seconds. A distress call, old and broken but unmistakable. It came from a derelict station orbiting a black hole on the edge of known space. Cale recognized the frequency. It was a veiled kin beacon. Lyra went pale when he told her that station was a sanctuary. She said they hid there during the Great Purge. If it is still sending a signal, someone might still be alive. Or it is a trap maybe, but I have to know. Cale did not argue. He set course for the black hole. The station hung in the void like a dead eye. Its hull pitted and scarred, its lights long dark. Only the beacon pulsed weakly from the central spire as they drew closer. Ember grew restless, pacing the cockpit, its scales flaring brighter than usual. Something is wrong, Cale said. Lyra nodded, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The station is not empty. They docked in the only bay with a functioning seal. The air inside was stale and cold, the walls lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly when Lyra passed by them. They moved slowly, Cale in front, blaster ready, Ember at his side, its claws clicking softly on the metal floor. Lyra followed in her chair, her eyes scanning every shadow deep in the heart of the station. They found a chamber sealed with a door of pure crystal, etched with the same coiled serpent sigil from Zirin's palace. Lyra's breath caught. He was here before Cale could react. The door slid open on its own inside. The room was empty except for a single pedestal in the center. On it rested an egg knot. A bird's egg. Not a reptile's egg, but something smooth and black with veins of silver running through it like lightning. Ember froze, then let out a low, mournful sound. Lyra rolled forward slowly, her hands trembling. That is a star egg, she whispered, the kind my people used to carry when they traveled. It holds a piece of the void inside. As she reached out to touch it, the egg pulsed with light, and a voice echoed in their minds, not spoken but felt. "You are not him," the voice said. "No," Lyra replied. "I am his daughters." Silence, then the egg floated into the air and hovered before her. The voice came again, softer. "No. He bound us, he silenced us, but you are free." The egg split open, not with a crack but with a sigh, and from within emerged a wisp of light that coiled around Lyra's wrist like a bracelet. Ember bowed its head. Cale watched in awe as Lyra's eyes glowed silver white. For a moment, then returned to normal. What was that, a memory? She said a guide and a warning. Zirin came here years ago. He took what he could and sealed the rest. But he missed this. She looked at Cale, her expression hardening. "He has more of my people, hidden somewhere where." His Palasikel nodded. "Then that is where we." Gumber let out a low growl of agreement, its scales now burning with a steady golden light. They left the station behind its beacon, falling silent as if finally at peace. The ship turned toward the heart of Zirin's domain, not as fugitives, not as victims, but as something new. Something the galaxy had not seen in centuries, an elf who could shape the world with stillness, a human who walked beside her without fear, and a dragon born of stars ready to burn the lies away. The freighter hung in the silent dark just beyond the outer sensor net of Zirin's world. A planet wrapped in storms of violet lightning and veiled in clouds that shimmered like poisoned silk from orbit. The Xenolord's palace rose like a jagged crown of glass and bone, its towers piercing the sky, its walls humming with old power. Lyra sat in the cockpit, her hands folded in her lap, her silver eyes fixed on the shape below. Ember lay coiled at her feet, its scales dimmed to a dull rust to avoid detection. Kyle studied the approach vectors on the screen, his jaw set tight. They had planned this for cycles. Every weakness, every blind spot, every shift in the guard rotation. The eclipse festival began tonight. Once every 30 cycles, the twin moons of Zirin's world aligned, casting the palace in perfect shadow. For exactly 2 hours during that time, tradition demanded all guards wear ceremonial masks of laughter and carry no weapons beyond ceremonial blades. It was a time of revelry, of mockery, of forgetting, perfect for infiltration. Cale turned to Lyra. "You ready?" She nodded once, her breath steady. Ember lifted its head and let out a soft hum, the sound vibrating through the deck like a promise. They suited up in dark cloaks. Woven from Ember's shed scales, the fabric absorbed light and muffled sound. Lyra's hovering chair had been modified to run silent, its hum reduced to a whisper that vanished in the wind. They left the ship hidden in the shadow of a dead comet and descended in a stolen skiff, its hull scarred and unmarked. The landing pad was crowded with guests arriving in ornate transports, their laughter sharp and brittle. Lyra stayed low in her chair, her face hidden beneath a deep hood. Cale walked beside her, his posture relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, playing the part of a servant. No one looked twice at a broken girl and her handler. They passed through the outer gates, the same ones Cale had stood before cycles ago. The statues still lined the path, their frozen faces twisted in silent screams. The air still smelled of ozone and something sour. But now Lyra felt it differently. Now she felt the threads of power woven into the very stone, the bindings her father had placed to keep his secrets. Safe, she reached out with her mind, not to break but to listen. The palace answered. They moved deeper into the halls. The festival in full swing. Guests in glittering masks danced in the grand atrium. Music from strange instruments filled the air. A melody that twisted and coiled like smoke. Lyra kept her eyes down, her hands still, but her mind raced, tracing the hidden paths beneath the floor. The vaults where her people slept. Kyle guided her through side corridors, avoiding the main flow of revelers. Ember followed as a shadow slipping through gaps too small for anything else, its golden eyes scanning for threats. They reached the lower levels where the music faded and the air grew cold. The walls here were smooth and seamless. No doors, no seams, just endless polished stone. This is it, Lyra whispered. She placed her palm flat against the wall, and the stone breathed. A doorway opened, not with a hinge or a lock, but with a slow unfolding of the material itself, like petals blooming in reverse. They stepped through into a narrow passage that sealed behind them, leaving no trace. The passage sloped downward, the air growing heavier with each step until they reached a vast chamber lit by a soft blue glow from crystals embedded in the walls, and, sealing in the center of the room, stood dozens of stasis pods, tall and slender, each one filled with a figure wrapped in silver thread, their faces calm, their bodies still veiled. Kinlyra's breath caught. "They're alive," she said. "Barely," Kale replied, "but we can wake them." She moved to the nearest pod, her hands hovering just above the surface. She closed her eyes and reached out with her power, not to shape, but to soothe, to untangle the bindings woven into the stasis field. The pod hissed open, the elf inside gasped and collapsed forward. Kale caught her gently, her skin cold, her eyes fluttering open wide with confusion and fear. "It is all right," Kale said softly. "You are safely." Ra moved to the next pod. Then the next. Her movements slow but sure, each pod opening with a soft sigh as the stasis field unraveled under her touch. Ember stood guard at the entrance, its body tense, its scales beginning to glow faintly. They were halfway through when the ground trembled. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the chamber, not from the festival above, but from the palace itself, an alarm. "He knows," Lyra whispered. Kale drew his blaster. "How many more? 12. Do it fast." She nodded and pressed her hands against 2 pods at once, her brow furrowing with effort. The air around her shimmered like heat haze as the stasis fields collapsed one after another. The freed veiled kin stumbled out, dazed but alive. Kale helped them to the passage, urging them to move quickly. Ember growled low in its throat, its head snapping toward the entrance. "They are coming." Kale turned just as the wall exploded inward. Not with fire, but with shards of living glass that reformed into figures tall and slender with faces like smooth mirrors. They were Ziran's sentinels, constructs, of his will made to hunt and containly. Ra pushed the last of the veiled kin toward the passage. "Go," she said to Kale. "Take them." "What about you?" "I have to hold them." Kale hesitated only a second, then nodded. He herded the freed kin into the passage, Ember at his heels, its body coiled tight, ready to fight or flee. He returned to face the sentinels alone. They advanced slowly, their movements fluid, their mirror faces reflecting her still form. "You are not supposed to move," they said in unison. Their voices, like breaking glass. "He was never broken," she replied. She placed her palms flat on the floor and the chamber answered. The ground surged upward, not as stone, but as liquid light wrapping around the sentinels, freezing them mid-step. The walls bent inward, sealing the entrance. The ceiling lowered like a closing fist, trapping the constructs in a cage of solid will. But Lyra did not stop. She reached deeper past the stone, past the metal, into the very bones of the palace, into the threads of power her father had woven to control this place. And she pulled above in the throne room. Ziran felt at first a tremor in his control, a snap in the bindings he had placed so long ago. He rose from his throne, his mask slipping from his face, his eyes wide with disbelief. No ran through the halls, his robes trailing behind him, guards stumbling out of his way as the palace groaned around them. He reached the vault chamber. Just as the last sentinel shattered into dust, Lyra stood in the center of the room, her silver eyes blazing, her shawl torn, her breath ragged but steady. "You," she breathed. Ziran stared at her, his face twisting from shock to fury, to something like fear. "You were supposed to be still," he snarled. "You were supposed to be quiet. I was never yours to silence." He lunged for her, his hands outstretched not to strike but to bind, to reseal the power he had spent. Cycles suppressing. But Lyra did not move. She simply looked at him, and his throne room answered. The glass floor beneath his feet softened, then rose like vines wrapping around his limbs, not cutting, not crushing, but holding him in place. The walls bloomed with glowing symbols, the same ones from the derelict station, the same ones her people had carved into the stars. "You think this is power?" he spat, struggling against the bonds. "No," Lyra said, stepping forward, her chair hovering behind her like a shadow. "This is justice." She raised her hand not in anger but in finality, and the palace became a cage knot of glass, not of bone, but of singing, vines that hummed with ancient songs and held him without bloodshed, without cruelty, just stillness, just truth. Above them, The freed veiled kin gathered in the atrium, their silver eyes wide with wonder, as the storm clouds parted and the twin moons aligned in perfect eclipse. The festival of laughter had ended and something new had begun. The palace stood silent under the twin moons. Its towers no longer proud but humbled, its glass walls now threaded with soft glowing vines that pulsed like slow heartbeats. Inside the throne room, Zirin sat bound, not by chains, but by living roots that curled gently around his limbs, their touch light yet unbreakable. He did not scream, he did not rage. He simply stared at the empty space where Lyra had stood, his face pale, his eyes hollow as if something inside him had finally cracked. Outside, in the grand atrium, the veiled kin gathered, their silver eyes reflecting the moonlight, their bodies still weak from cycles in stasis, but their spirits awake for the first time in years. They looked to Lyra not as a daughter of their blood, but as something more, a voice, a bridge between what they were and what they could become. Cale stood at the edge of the crowd, his blaster holstered, his coat torn, his face bruised but calm. Ember lay at his feet, its scales dimmed to a soft gold. Its head resting on its paws, watching everything with ancient eyes. Lyra moved among her people, slowly, her hovering chair gliding over the polished floor. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were clear and quiet. She told them they were free. They did not have to hide, they did not have to be still forever. But freedom is not a place. She said it is a choice. One of the older veiled kin stepped forward, his hair white as starlight, his hands trembling. "What do we do now?" "You live," she said simply. "You shape your own path." They looked to each other, then to the sky, then to the battered freighter waiting on the landing pad, its hull scarred but whole, and so they chose not to rule, not to rebuild Zirin's broken empire. But to leave. Kyle did not ask why. He simply opened the ramp and let them board one by one. Ember guided them with soft nudges, its presence calming their fear. The ship was not built for so many, but it would hold. It always died as the last of the veiled kin stepped aboard. Lyra turned. "To Cale, you do not have to do this. Do what carry us." He looked at her, then at the ship, then at the stars beyond. "I am not carrying you," he said. "You are walking beside me." She smiled faintly, then nodded. They lifted off as the first rays of dawn touched the palace spires below. The vines glowed brighter as if in farewell. The storm clouds parted, and for the first time in cycles, the sky was clear. On board the freighter, the veiled kin settled into every corner, the cargo bay, the mess hall, even the engine room. They did not speak much, but their stillness was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Ember moved among them, its warmth a steady comfort. Cale sat in the cockpit, Lyra beside him, her hands resting on the armrests of her chair. "Where to now?" he asked. He looked out at the stars, wherever they need us. They flew not toward the core worlds, not toward the war zones, but into the fringe. The forgotten places, the broken systems where hope had long since faded. They did not bring armies. They did not bring weapons. They brought something quieter, something stronger. In a mining colony crushed under corporate debt, Lyra sat in the town square. Her hands folded, her eyes closed, and the rusted machines around her groaned back to life, gears turning clean, water flowing from dry pipes. The people wept, not from fear but from wonder, in a refugee camp drifting between stars. Cale stood guard while the veiled kin shaped shelters from scrap metal and old hull plates. Ember curled around the edges, its fire warming the cold void in a dead system where a planet's core had cooled and crops failed. Lyra knelt on the barren soil, her palms pressed to the earth, and deep below, something stirred. The ground trembled, not with quake, but with life-green shoots. Pushing through ash within hours, the fields bloomed. News spread fast in the outer rim, of a silent elf woman who could mend the broken with stillness, of a human who asked for nothing but stood between the weak and the cruel, of a dragon whose fire did not burn but healed. Some called them saviors, others called them fools. Most just called them hope. The core worlds laughed at first, dismissing the rumors as fringe superstition. But when a corporate fleet tried to seize the mining colony, the machines turned against them. Wrenches became weapons, pipes became cages, and the fleet fled screaming about witchblood and cursed earth. The quiet war had begun, not with bombs, not with speeches, but with hands that shaped and hearts that refused to break back. On the freighter, life settled into a new rhythm. Lyra still trained, still pushed her limits, but now she did not fear the void. She listened to it, and it listened back. Ember grew larger, its scales now shimmering with streaks of silver, its eyes holding depths that no creature should know. Kale kept watch always, but he no longer carried the weight alone. The veiled kin stood with him, their stillness a shield, their presence a promise. One night, as they drifted through a nebula painted in soft reds and golds, Lyra sat with Kale in the observation blister, the stars stretching endlessly before them. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked. "What old life? The one before me, before all this?" He looked at her, then at the ship behind them filled with sleeping kin and a dragon dreaming of stars. "No," he said, "this is the first time I have felt like I belong." She leaned back, her silver eyes reflecting the nebulum tooth. They did not speak again that night, but the silence between them was full, not empty. Far behind them in his vine-bound throne, Zirin watched the stars through his shattered windows, his empire crumbling not from invasion, but from irrelevance. The galaxy had moved on, and he was no longer the center of its story. Ahead, the freighter sailed on, its hull patched, its engines humming, its crew whole. They were not heroes in the old sense. They did not wear capes or carry banners. They were simply people who chose to stand when others ran to shape, when others broke to burn away lies with quiet. Fire in the galaxy would never be the same.